Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new video, and today we're going to be talking about the Commerce Clause. I'm going to explain the history of it, run through the case Gibbons v. Ogden, and then we're going to talk about two other cases and how it was used to destroy segregation. On top of that, we're also going to discuss potential negative ramifications that may arise from the Commerce Clause being used to justify civil rights legislation. So let's get into it. Alrighty, guys, so let's get into it. What exactly is the Commerce Clause? Well, the Commerce Clause is found in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, and it states that Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And what I just read to you actually comprises the three different commerce clauses that people usually refer to, and those are the Foreign Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, and the Indian Commerce Clause. And what we're most interested in today is actually the Interstate Commerce Clause. Of course, interstate meaning between the states. And the Commerce Clause has actually been used historically to expand federal power and jurisdiction. And I actually don't have a slide on it, and it doesn't matter much, and it doesn't pertain to today's discussion too much. But there's actually something called the Dormant Commerce Clause that I want to talk about for a second. And it's kind of the inverse, and a lot of people don't know about this. So while the Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate commerce, the Dormant Commerce Clause, or as some people refer to it as the Negative Commerce Clause, actually makes it so that the states can't regulate commerce under most circumstances. It's actually meant to protect against state protectionism. But yeah, again, it doesn't pertain much to today's discussion, but it's something that's probably pretty important to know. And as you see here, I have a little quote from Tony Soprano. And this is actually, I think, from a season one episode where I think Christopher Moltisanti actually robs a big rig semi truck or something. And Tony Soprano rightfully points out that that's interstate commerce, you mama Luke. And because of that, that would actually be a federal crime. So he's like, what, do you want to go away for a few years or what? So as you can see here, I wrote on top, Tony was well educated on the Constitution. So you got to give him props for that. Alrighty, Mamalukes, let's look at the case of Gibbons v. Ogden. In this case, I mean, the facts of the case don't matter too much. They're not really relevant, and it's actually a little confusing. It has to do with a feud between like two people, but all you really got to know is that the case has to do with legislation passed by New York that regulated travel. So, yeah, something along those lines, but let's get into the ruling of this case and the wider implications it has had. So, this case actually expanded the definition of the word commerce. So, it set a precedent that the word commerce now included navigation, transportation, and mere travel in general. So, keep that in the back of your heads because that's very important to know going forward. And it also set the precedent that states couldn't enact legislation that interfered with Congress' jurisdiction over commerce. And that's kind of the concept that I explained earlier with the negative commerce clause or the dormant commerce clause. But ultimately, all you really have to know from this case is that it expanded the definition of commerce to travel. Knowing that, you'll understand how it was used to push forth civil rights legislation. So let's look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act actually outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And it also prohibits segregation in public accommodations, which you're probably going to hear me refer to as Title II, because that part was under Title II within the Act. And let's run over what public accommodations actually are first, because don't get confused like I did when I first read this act. I thought public accommodations just applied to public and government buildings and offices and businesses, but it doesn't. Public accommodations applies to private or public facilities used by the public. So think any business, any store, motels, restaurant. Those are public accommodations. And it also prohibited employment discrimination and unequal application of voter registration requirements. And yeah, I mean, all that's very important, but what we're focusing on today is the segregation part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And when Congress passed this act, they actually used the Commerce Clause as justification. This was because to Congress, private businesses and public accommodation facilities being able to segregate actually impacted the flow of interstate commerce. So if that sounds a little confusing to you, that's okay, because these two cases I'm going to talk about now actually go into this more in depth, because unsurprisingly, people actually challenged this application of the Commerce Clause. So let's look at the case of Katzenbach v. McClung. And in this case, a Birmingham restaurant owner only provided dine-in service to white people. And if I remember the facts of this case correctly, African Americans could still do takeout. So I guess whoever owned this restaurant was very generous. The owner tried to challenge the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and two important facts to know are that the restaurant was near an interstate and state highway, and they also sourced food from out of state. And you're going to see why that matters in a second. So the Supreme Court actually used the Commerce Clause to uphold the Civil Rights Act because forbidding discrimination in places that serve interstate travelers or food that has been moved in interstate commerce is a valid exercise of the Commerce Clause. So this is definitely a stretch of the Commerce Clause, maybe one that the founding fathers and drafters hadn't intended, but you can't really argue that it's being used with good intentions here. So let's look at another case called the Heart of Motel Inc. v. United States. And the facts of this case are that a motel in Atlanta, Georgia also practiced segregation opposing African Americans. And similarly to the restaurant that we just discussed, the motel was likewise situated close to an interstate highway and served out of state patrons. And the owner challenged the Civil Rights Act, saying Congress overstepped its authority under the Commerce Clause. And even though the guy's a racist, he has somewhat of a point here, because, like I've previously said, this was definitely not the intended use of the Commerce Clause, and this is definitely an example of Congress using interpretation of the Constitution to extend their powers. So the Supreme Court actually upheld Title II and its application. And remember, Title II is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which forbids segregation in public accommodations. And the Supreme Court also said Congress was within their jurisdiction to use the Commerce Clause as justification. So, what are the implications of all this? And while we can probably all agree that this was all done for a good and noble cause, I personally believe that resting such important legislation on such a flimsy justification is like building a house on a bad foundation. And that's for several reasons. So, number one is imagine if future courts reversed the scope of the Commerce Clause set as precedent in Gibbons v. Ogden. So remember Gibbons v. Ogden, we talked about how the definition of commerce was expanded to include travel. Well, imagine if future courts actually disagree with that interpretation and go back on precedent, which is rare, but it's not like that doesn't happen because we now have civil rights legislation which rests upon this interpretation of the Commerce Clause and this expanded definition of commerce. So if that were to change, what would happen to that civil rights legislation? And do you think it would potentially be possible one day to destroy that interstate commerce link? Because look at the cases of Katzenbach and Heart of Atlanta Motel. In those cases, both businesses were situated pretty well near interstate highways. And in the case of Katzenbach specifically, they were using out of state food. And in the case of Heart of Atlanta Motel, they were serving out of state patrons. But what if you had a business out in the sticks, not anywhere near an interstate or state highway, that didn't serve out of state patrons and that didn't source food or other equipment from out of state? Could you still use the Commerce Clause to prohibit that business from segregating? And ultimately, that's what worries me because this very important legislation is built upon using some very faulty logic, and that opens it to scrutiny one day, scrutiny that it probably shouldn't have, scrutiny that it should be shielded from. And ultimately, that's why I think that we should have used better constitutional arguments to actually pass and defend the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So let's discuss some of my final thoughts. So Congress and the Supreme Court of the United States successfully used the Commerce Clause to pass civil rights legislation and to destroy private practices of discrimination. We know that already. That's what we just talked about. And could this have negative consequences one day? So, like I just talked about, could that foundation all come crumbling down just because we used faulty logic and justification to pass some of the most important legislation in the history of our nation? And ultimately, that's what I want to hear from you guys. I want to have a discussion down below about whether or not you think that this could have negative consequences one day. So I know this was a very loaded topic, but I want to hear your guys' thoughts. If you have any ideas, suggestions, drop them down below. Let's have a discussion. And thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe. I'm still a brand new channel, so everything that you guys do for me helps me a lot at this stage. So that's it, guys. Have a great day.